Maria Santos had always been different from the other recruits at Fort McKinley. While her fellow soldiers struggled with the basic requirements of military life, she moved through training with a quiet determination that caught the attention of both instructors and peers. Born and raised in rural Texas, she had grown up on her grandfather's ranch where shooting wasn't just a hobby, it was a necessity for protecting livestock and putting food on the table. The morning of the annual marksmanship qualification started like any other day at the base. The sun was barely visible through the early morning mist as soldiers lined up at the armory to receive their assigned weapons. Maria stood in line, her military-issued boots polished to perfection, her uniform crisp despite the humid weather that seemed to cling to everything in the area. Sergeant Williams, a veteran instructor with 23 years of service, moved down the line, distributing rifles with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. When he reached Maria, he grabbed what appeared to be a standard M4 carbine from the rack and handed it to her without much thought. The rifle looked identical to all the others. Black polymer stock, standard barrel length, regulation scope, mounted on top. But Maria noticed something immediately. The moment her hands wrapped around the weapon, she could feel that something was off. The balance was wrong. The weight distribution didn't match what she had trained with for the past 8 months. As she conducted her initial inspection, running her hands along the barrel and checking the mechanisms, she discovered several concerning issues that would have sent most soldiers back to the armory for a replacement weapon. The bolt carrier group moved with more resistance than it should have. The trigger had an unusual amount of play before engaging. Most troubling of all, when she looked down the barrel using proper clearing procedures, she could see that the rifling the spiral grooves that give a bullet its spin and accuracy appeared to be damaged in several places. Dark spots along the barrel suggested corrosion or wear that should have removed this weapon from service months ago. Any reasonable person would have immediately reported these issues and requested a different rifle. Military protocol clearly stated that soldiers should inspect their weapons thoroughly and report any defects before proceeding to live fire exercises. The safety briefings had emphasized this point repeatedly throughout their training. But Maria faced a dilemma that many soldiers, particularly women and minorities, understood all too well. She had already encountered resistance from some instructors who seemed to question whether she belonged in combat training. Just 2 weeks earlier, during a field exercise, Sergeant Patterson had made comments about whether someone like her could handle the physical demands of military service. Another instructor had suggested that her previous shooting experience on the ranch was just farm work and wouldn't translate to military precision. Standing there in the morning mist, holding a clearly defective weapon, Maria made a decision that would change everything. Rather than risk being labeled as someone who made excuses or couldn't adapt to challenging situations, she decided to proceed with the qualification using the malfunctioning rifle. She would prove that her skills were real, that her place in the military was earned, not given. The shooting range at Fort McKinley was a sprawling complex designed to test soldiers under various conditions. The qualification course required marksmen to engage targets at distances ranging from 50 meters to 400 meters, using different shooting positions and time limits that simulated combat conditions. Soldiers were scored on accuracy, speed, and their ability to maintain composure under pressure. As Maria moved to her assigned firing position, she began developing a strategy to compensate for her weapon's deficiencies. During the practice rounds allowed before the official scoring began, she carefully observed how the rifle behaved. The damaged rifling caused bullets to drift consistently to the right and slightly low. The trigger's excessive play meant she had to adjust her finger placement and pull technique to achieve consistent shots. Other soldiers around her were settling into their positions with confidence, their weapons functioning exactly as designed. The soldier to her left, Private Johnson, was already grouping his practice shots within a tight circle at the 100-meter target. To her right, Private Walsh was making easy work of the 200-meter targets, his shots ringing the steel with satisfying metallic pings. Maria's practice shots told a different story. Even with perfect sight alignment and breathing control, her bullets were hitting several inches away from where she aimed. The rifle's inconsistency meant that each shot required individual compensation based on distance, wind conditions, and the particular quirks she was discovering about this specific weapon. But rather than becoming frustrated, Maria drew upon lessons learned during countless hours on her grandfather's ranch. She remembered times when they had been forced to use older rifles with worn barrels to protect cattle from predators. Her grandfather had taught her that a skilled marksman could adapt to any weapon. That understanding and working with a gun's particular characteristics was more valuable than having perfect equipment. During those practice rounds, Maria began mapping the rifle's behavior in her mind. At 50 meters, she needed to aim approximately 3 inches left and 2 inches high to hit center mass. At 100 meters, the compensation required increased to 5 inches left and 4 inches high. For longer distances, the calculations became more complex, requiring her to account not just for the weapon's defects, but also for wind conditions and the bullet's trajectory. The other soldiers began to notice that something was different about Maria's shooting. While their practice shots sounded sharp and clean, her rifle produced a slightly different report, a sound that experienced shooters would recognize as indicating mechanical issues. Some of the more observant soldiers started glancing in her direction, wondering why she was continuing to use a weapon that was clearly not functioning properly. Sergeant Williams, who was monitoring the practice session, also began to take notice. From his position behind the firing line, he could see that Maria's shots were not grouping where she was aiming, yet she continued to shoot with the same calm, methodical approach that had characterized her training from day one. He considered approaching her to investigate, but decided to observe longer to understand what was happening. As the practice period came to an end and soldiers prepared for the official qualification to begin, Maria felt a mixture of nervousness and determination that she had never experienced before. She knew that what she was attempting was risky, trying to achieve a qualifying score with a defective weapon, while also proving her capabilities to instructors who already doubted her abilities. The qualification would consist of multiple stages, each designed to test different aspects of marksmanship under pressure. Soldiers would have limited time to engage targets at various distances, with points awarded based on accuracy and proximity to the center of each target. A perfect score was 300 points, with anything above 280 considered exceptional performance. Most soldiers hoped simply to achieve the minimum qualifying score of 260 points. Only the most skilled marksmen typically scored above 290, and base records were usually set by soldiers with extensive shooting backgrounds, using perfectly maintained weapons under ideal conditions. As Maria checked her rifle one final time before the qualification began, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would not just qualify with this malfunctioning weapon, she would excel. She would prove that skill, determination, and adaptability were more important than perfect equipment. She would show everyone, including herself, that she belonged exactly where she was. The command, "Commence firing," echoed across the range as 42 soldiers began the most important shooting test of their military careers. The first stage required engaging targets at 50 meters from a supported prone position, generally considered the easiest portion of the qualification, since the close distance and stable shooting position allowed for high accuracy. Maria settled into her prone position, adjusting her body alignment and establishing a solid shooting foundation. Through her scope, the black bullseye target appeared sharp and clear, but she ignored the natural point of aim and instead focused on a spot several inches to the left and slightly above the center ring. Based on her practice rounds, this was where she needed to hold to compensate for her rifle's defects. The first shot broke cleanly, and Maria watched through her scope as the bullet struck exactly where she had intended, dead center of the target. The soldier next to her glanced over with surprise, having heard the unusual sound her rifle made, but seeing a perfect hit downrange. Maria allowed herself a small smile before chambering the next round. Shot after shot, Maria continued her mental calculations, adjusting her aim point based on the subtle changes in wind conditions and the rifle's increasingly erratic behavior as the barrel heated up. What other soldiers accomplished through straightforward aiming, Maria achieved through constant mathematical compensation and an intuitive understanding of her weapon's particular quirks. By the end of the first stage, Maria had scored a perfect 100 points despite using a rifle that should have made such accuracy impossible. The range safety officer conducting the scoring double-checked her target twice, unable to believe that the tight grouping of bullet holes had come from the soldier whose rifle was obviously having mechanical issues. The second stage moved to 100 meters, with soldiers shooting from a kneeling position significantly more challenging due to the increased distance and less stable shooting platform. The time limit was tighter, allowing only 60 seconds to engage 10 targets. This stage separated competent marksmen from exceptional ones, as it required both accuracy and speed under pressure. As Maria assumed the kneeling position, she could feel her heart rate increasing slightly. The rifle's weight felt different in this position, and she knew the mechanical issues would be more pronounced at the greater distance. Through her scope, the targets appeared much smaller, and the margin for error in her compensation calculations had decreased significantly. She took a deep breath, let it out halfway, and squeezed the trigger on her first shot. The bullet struck just outside the center ring, not perfect, but still a solid score. She quickly worked the bolt, chambered another round, and engaged the second target. This shot was closer to center, suggesting she was successfully adapting her technique to the new shooting position. Around her, other soldiers were finding the increased difficulty challenging. Several were struggling to maintain accuracy under the time pressure, and the sounds of missed shots hitting the backstop instead of targets became increasingly common. But Maria maintained her methodical approach, treating each shot as an individual problem to be solved, rather than part of a rushed sequence. Sergeant Williams had moved to a position where he could observe Maria more closely. He had 30 years of experience watching soldiers shoot, and what he was witnessing defied conventional understanding. The rifle she was using was clearly malfunctioning. He could see brass casings ejecting erratically, hear the different sound signature, and observe the obvious mechanical issues. Yet her targets showed groupings that would be impressive with a perfect weapon, let alone a defective one. By the end of the second stage, Maria had scored 98 points out of a possible 100, losing only 2 points due to a single shot that strayed slightly from the center ring when a gust of wind caught her off guard. Her cumulative score of 198 points put her well ahead of most soldiers at this point in the qualification. The third stage was where the qualification became truly demanding. Soldiers had to engage targets at 200 and 300 meters from a standing position, the least stable of all shooting positions. The targets appeared much smaller at these distances, and any minor error in technique or equipment would be magnified significantly. Time limits were even more restrictive, requiring soldiers to move quickly between targets while maintaining precision. Maria approached this stage with growing confidence in her ability to work with the malfunctioning rifle. She had developed an intuitive feel for how to compensate for its defects, almost like learning to drive a car with unique steering characteristics. The rifle had become an extension of herself, despite its mechanical problems. Standing unsupported with the rifle shouldered, Maria engaged her first 200-meter target. The shot felt good the moment she pulled the trigger, and through her scope she could see the bullet strike just left of center, exactly where she had aimed to compensate for the rifle's tendency to shoot right. She smoothly transitioned to the next target, made her compensation calculations, and fired again, with similar results. Other soldiers around her were struggling significantly with this stage. The combination of distance, unstable shooting position, and time pressure was proving too much for many. Some were barely hitting the target at all, while others were clustering their shots far from the center rings. The sound of missed shots became more frequent, and she could hear frustrated sighs and muttered complaints from her fellow soldiers. But Maria seemed to be operating in her own zone of focus and concentration. Each shot was deliberate and calculated, with compensation adjustments made automatically based on the patterns she had learned during the previous stages. Her grandfather's training on the ranch, where she had learned to make precise shots in various conditions with whatever equipment was available, was proving invaluable. The 300-meter targets represented the ultimate challenge. At this distance, the targets appeared as small dots through the scope, and the bullet's flight time was long enough that wind conditions could change between aiming and impact. Most soldiers considered themselves successful if they simply hit the target anywhere, with center ring hits being relatively rare. Maria took her time setting up for the first 300-meter shot. She observed the wind flags positioned along the range, noted the direction and strength of air movement, and calculated not just her weapon's built-in errors, but also the environmental factors that would affect bullet flight. She held her breath, steadied the crosshairs on her compensation point, and squeezed the trigger with smooth, consistent pressure. The shot surprised her with its precision. Through the spotting scope, she could see that the bullet had struck within the inner ring of the target, a shot that would have been impressive with a perfect rifle, let alone her malfunctioning weapon. A small crowd of instructors and range personnel had begun gathering behind her position, drawn by reports of the unusual performance they were witnessing. Target after target, Maria continued delivering precise shots at the extended range. Her compensation techniques had become so refined that she was achieving better accuracy than most soldiers with properly functioning equipment. The mental mathematics required for each shot, calculating weapon defects, wind compensation, distance adjustments, and time pressures, would have overwhelmed most marksmen, but Maria processed it all with calm efficiency. As the final stage of the qualification concluded, Maria lowered her rifle and stepped back from the firing line. She felt exhausted but exhilarated, knowing that she had just accomplished something extraordinary. The mental and physical demands of compensating for her rifle's problems while maintaining precision under pressure had pushed her abilities to their absolute limits. Sergeant Williams approached her position as the range officers began scoring the final targets. His expression was a mixture of amazement and suspicion. He had never seen anything like what he had just witnessed, and he needed to understand how it was possible. "Soldier," he said in his gruff instructor voice, "I need to examine your weapon." Maria handed over the rifle without hesitation, knowing that her performance would speak for itself, regardless of what the inspection revealed. Sergeant Williams immediately noticed the mechanical issues she had been dealing with throughout the qualification. The bolt carrier group showed excessive wear, the trigger mechanism was clearly compromised, and when he looked down the barrel, he could see the damaged rifling that should have made accurate shooting nearly impossible. "How long have you known about these problems?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Since this morning, Sergeant," Maria replied honestly. "I noticed the issues during initial inspection, but decided to proceed with the qualification anyway." The range officer responsible for scoring approached with Maria's final target and score sheet. His expression showed the same disbelief that Sergeant Williams was feeling. The numbers on the sheet seemed impossible given the condition of her weapon. Maria's final score was 294 points out of a possible 300, not only a qualifying score, but a performance that placed her among the top marksmen in the base's history. More importantly, it was accomplished under circumstances that should have made such accuracy impossible. Word spread through Fort McKinley like wildfire. By evening, every soldier on base had heard about the recruit who had set a new marksmanship record using a rifle that should have been retired from service months ago. The story grew with each telling, but the facts remained remarkable enough that no embellishment was necessary. Captain Rodriguez, the base commander, requested a full investigation into what had occurred. He wanted to understand not just how Maria had achieved such an exceptional score, but also how a clearly defective weapon had made it into the qualification rotation. The investigation would reveal several important findings that would change protocols across the entire training facility. The damaged rifle was sent to the base armorer for complete evaluation. Technical Sergeant Murphy, who had maintained military weapons for 15 years, conducted a thorough inspection that documented the extent of the rifle's problems. The barrel rifling showed severe wear that reduced accuracy by an estimated 40%. The trigger mechanism had excessive creep and overtravel that made consistent shot timing nearly impossible. Most significantly, the bolt carrier group had tolerances so loose that proper chamber pressure and bullet velocity were inconsistent from shot to shot. "In my professional opinion," Technical Sergeant Murphy wrote in his official report, "this weapon should have been removed from service no later than 6 months ago. The fact that anyone achieved a qualifying score with this rifle is remarkable. The fact that someone set a base record with it is unprecedented and suggests extraordinary marksmanship ability." The investigation also revealed how the defective rifle had entered the qualification rotation. A miscommunication during a recent armory reorganization had resulted in weapons scheduled for disposal being mixed with serviceable rifles. Several other defective weapons were discovered and immediately removed from service, preventing other soldiers from facing the same challenges Maria had encountered. But the most significant finding was Maria's score itself. When officials compared her 294-point performance to historical records, they discovered it was the highest marksmanship qualification score achieved at Fort McKinley in over 12 years. The previous record of 292 points had been set by a competitive shooter with Olympic-level experience, using a precision-tuned rifle under ideal conditions. Captain Rodriguez made the decision to formally recognize Maria's achievement. In a base-wide ceremony held the following Friday, she was awarded the Army Commendation Medal for exceptional performance and presented with a certificate acknowledging her new base record. The ceremony drew attention from local media and senior military officials who wanted to understand the story behind this remarkable achievement. During the ceremony, Captain Rodriguez addressed the assembled soldiers with words that would be remembered long after Maria had completed her service. Specialist Santos demonstrated that true marksmanship is not about having perfect equipment, but about adapting to conditions and maintaining standards regardless of circumstances. Her performance exemplifies the military values of excellence, perseverance, and problem-solving under pressure. The impact of Maria's achievement extended far beyond personal recognition. Her story became a case study used in military training programs to illustrate the importance of adaptability and mental resilience. Marksmanship instructors began incorporating exercises that required soldiers to adapt to equipment irregularities, preparing them for real-world situations where perfect conditions might not exist. More importantly, Maria's success changed perceptions about her capabilities and those of other soldiers who had faced similar doubts. Sergeant Patterson, who had previously questioned whether she belonged in combat training, became one of her strongest advocates. He later admitted that her performance had forced him to reconsider his assumptions about what made an effective soldier. "I learned something important that day," Sergeant Patterson would later tell new recruits. "Skill and determination matter more than any preconceived notions about who can succeed in military service." Specialist Santos taught all of us that excellence comes from character, not from fitting a particular mold. The defective rifle itself became something of a legend at Fort McKinley. Rather than being destroyed as originally planned, it was mounted in a display case at the base shooting range, with a plaque describing Maria's record-setting performance. The display served as a reminder to future soldiers that obstacles could become opportunities for those willing to adapt and persevere. Maria's military career continued to flourish following her record-setting performance. She was selected for advanced marksmanship instructor training and eventually became responsible for teaching new recruits the fundamentals of precision shooting. Her unique experience with the malfunctioning rifle gave her insights into troubleshooting and adaptation techniques that proved invaluable in her instructional role. During her time as an instructor, Maria developed training methods that prepared soldiers for less than ideal conditions. She created exercises that simulated equipment malfunctions, environmental challenges, and time pressures that soldiers might face in actual combat situations. Her students consistently scored higher on their qualifications compared to recruits trained using traditional methods. One of her most effective teaching techniques involved having students practice with intentionally imperfect equipment rifles with slightly loose scopes, triggers with unusual pull characteristics, or stocks that didn't quite fit properly. These exercises taught soldiers to adapt their techniques rather than rely solely on equipment perfection, creating more versatile and confident marksmen. "Equipment will fail you," Maria would tell her students during training sessions. "Environmental conditions will be challenging. Time pressures will make everything more difficult. But if you understand the fundamentals and learn to adapt, you can succeed regardless of circumstances. The rifle doesn't make the marksman makes the rifle work." Her reputation extended beyond Fort McKinley as other training facilities requested her expertise in developing adaptive marksmanship programs. Military publications featured articles about her techniques, and she was invited to speak at conferences where experienced soldiers and trainers gathered to share knowledge and best practices. Years later, when Maria reflected on that morning when she had been handed a malfunctioning rifle, she realized it had been one of the most formative experiences of her military career. The decision to proceed with a defective weapon rather than request a replacement had initially been driven by a desire to prove herself and avoid appearing weak or unprepared, but the experience taught her lessons that extended far beyond marksmanship. She learned that obstacles often revealed capabilities she didn't know she possessed. She discovered that adaptation and problem-solving were more valuable skills than the ability to perform well under perfect conditions. Most importantly, she understood that excellence was not about avoiding challenges, but about meeting them with preparation, determination, and creativity. The base record she set that day stood for 8 years, before finally being surpassed by another soldier. Ironically, one of her former students who had learned adaptive shooting techniques in her classes, when informed that her record had been broken, Maria felt nothing but pride and satisfaction that the methods she had developed were helping others achieve even greater success. The malfunctioning rifle that had started everything remained in its display case at the Fort McKinley shooting range, a permanent reminder of an extraordinary day when determination and skill overcame equipment failure. New recruits would often pause to read the plaque describing Maria's achievement, and many would ask their instructors to tell them the full story of the soldier who turned a broken weapon into a pathway to excellence. Maria Santos had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from having perfect conditions, but from making the most of imperfect ones. Her story became part of Fort McKinley's legacy, a testament to the truth that real strength is measured not by the absence of obstacles, but by the ability to transform those obstacles into opportunities for extraordinary achievement.